Managing your Kestra instance with Git just got so much easier with our latest addition to the Git plugin. We've now added two new tasks, TenantSync and NamespaceSync. Both of these tasks synchronize Kestra objects in a specific context. TenantSync being for all namespaces in a tenant, and NamespaceSync being for all objects inside a single namespace. Let me jump into an example to show you how this works so you can level up your Git integration with Kestra. So as you can see here inside of Kestra, I actually have two different workflows in the system namespace. I've got my TenantSync one and my NamespaceSync. Now, we'll start with the TenantSync. Now, I'm using the Enterprise Edition here, which will allow me to sync in different tenants. Now, I've got three different tenants here, as you can see, example, demo, and video. The way this works is it will sync everything in the tenant that this workflow runs in. So if you want to be able to sync different tenants, you'll need to have this flow set up in all three of those tenants, or however many you've got. So in this scenario, I'm in the demo tenant. This means it's going to synchronize everything inside of the demo tenant with my Git repository. Now, as you can see, this is a single task. What we've got are a few different properties, and these properties are similar between the TenantSync and the NamespaceSync. So you can use these sort of interchangeably. Now, key ones to sort of look out for are source of truth. Now, if we have a little look at the documentation here, we can see source of truth, which is down the bottom here, has two values, Git and Kestra. So when you run this workflow, you can tell it, I want this to make sure that it is matching Kestra or matching my Git repository. It depends on how you're using Kestra, depends on which one you might want to pick. If you always want to make sure Kestra is matching your Git repository, then set this to Git. And then the second property that's important here is the when missing in source. So basically, if a value is not available, such as in Kestra or in the Git repository, what it should do. As you can see here, you've got three options here. We've got keep, we've got delete, and we've got fail. So you've got options there for how you want to manage when there is a difference between the source of truth and the other part, which could be Git or Kestra. So you can make sure you don't lose anything, because obviously using delete could be a little bit dangerous. Now, another property that we have here is the protected namespace one. Now, this is pretty useful and only available inside of the TenantSync one, but this basically means that this namespace is protected from any sort of deletion. This is important because system namespace, for example, is often where you'd have sort of critical flows for maintaining your Kestra instance, and you also want to make sure that this flow, when it runs, doesn't get removed or deleted so that you don't run into any issues. So this is quite useful if you've got those namespaces that you just need to make sure that do not interact with this whatsoever. You can keep those nice and tidy with this property. Now, we've also got Kestra URL and authentication. So this is currently set up to target the Kestra instance I'm using right now, which is running inside of this Docker container on localhost 8080. And I've also got my username and password for logging into Kestra to authenticate using basic auth. But you can also use things such as the API tokens in the Enterprise Edition. Now, this is useful because you don't necessarily have to run this inside of this Kestra instance. You can also target this to point at a different Kestra instance as well if you wanted. And if you are doing that, then you can also specify a tenant ID too. So by default, it will use the tenant that this workflow is running in, but you could then specify for a separate Kestra instance to use a specific tenant. So you could manage all of that in a separate instance, especially useful if you've got like a production instance and maybe a develop instance. And then at the bottom here, I've got some Git authentication, so I can authenticate with GitHub, my username and my access token. So this gives you a good idea of what to expect. Now, I have just made a new repository here. It's called video example. I'm just going to put that URL in here. And when we've clicked save and press execute, what we'll see is it's going to run and it's going to synchronize everything into that repository. So if I give this a refresh, we'll see there's a new commit. So what we can see here is it doesn't just synchronize your flows, it synchronizes all objects inside of Kestra. So that includes your flows, your namespace files, any apps you may have, your dashboards, as well as unit tests. So everything in Kestra can now be version controlled, not just your flows and namespace files. And instead of having to run separate tasks for them all, like you would have done for push flows and for push namespace files, now you can manage it with one centralized task. And as we can look in here, we can see we've got the different dashboards that I had set up. We can see those all in there like so. I can also go to company.team here, and I can see inside of this namespace, I have apps. I can also see the files that I had inside of there too, and any workflows. So everything here is nicely managed, and I can now make changes in here and then synchronize them back to Kestra as well if I wanted. Now here's a quick look at the namespace sync. Again, it works in practice very similarly to what we saw with the tenant sync, but this time it's going to focus on a specific namespace. Now, I have specified that to be company.team, which is important because I want to run this workflow inside the system namespace. And as you can see from the Git repository that I have here, if I just open that in a new tab, we can see that it has in fact synced that specific namespace, and we can see that it again has followed that same pattern that we saw with TenantSync. Now, what I can do is go in here and change this. So I believe company.ai was also a namespace that I had. If I click sync on that now, we can go over to here and see that it's now added that as a separate directory. So if you would rather not sync every namespace at the same time, maybe you'd like to be able to just focus on some more than others, maybe some you don't want to put into Git very often, but others you do, then what you can do here is just manage the namespaces one at a time, but you'll get the exact same behavior as you would see with TenantSync. So this works really nicely in both those sort of cases. Something else you can do is actually add author, email, and name. So you'll see here it says added the commit from root. I don't really like this. I don't really like how generic this is, but you can specify some details. So here I'm going to synchronize the system namespace now. As you'll see, when I push the commit here, we'll be able to refresh this repository and see that I've now got my face added here and it's linked to my GitHub account. So we can see that I was the one who made this change, which is useful if you might have multiple instances and you want to see which of those instances has in fact pushed those changes to your Git repository and not necessarily just say root. So pretty handy if you've got lots of different things going on there. So hopefully you found that useful, and TenantSync and NamespaceSync are going to become part of your routine when version controlling your workflows. Let me know in the comments below how you're going to version control your workflows and any features you'd love to see in the future. And remember, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel as it helps us out a load.